Hey everyone, and welcome to another Kanoa Reviews. Today we talk about Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, a PC title that was released back in 2004 to some horrible sales and mediocre reviews, but over time has gathered a large cult following and active community that still put out content and patches for it today. Nowadays, when one mentions Vampire Bloodlines, people talk about a very buggy game, but one that offers one of the best RPG experiences of all time. Let's see if this statement does indeed still hold up. Now, I'm actually not new to this game at all. In fact, I bought this game back in 2004 in the year when it came out. Partially, it was because I heard it was a very solid RPG, where you could handle missions in many of different ways. But maybe indeed also because I was 14 at the time, with hormones raging through my body, and so the images I saw of poster child Jeanette, a busty school outfit wearing vampire, might have also drawn me to it. Anyway, first let's talk a little bit of history, since Vampire Bloodlines deserves it. Bloodlines was made by Troika Games, who had multiple people working on it that also made the original Fallout games. In a way, they wanted to implement the same type of freedom to tackle missions and situations like you could in Fallout, but this time with a first or third person perspective. It was obvious that also a lot of influences were taken from the original Deus Ex with its level design, where a closed door could often be bypassed by finding a back door in an alley or maybe a vent you could crawl through. Bloodlines also earned the nickname Deus Ex Bloodlines by some, and in all honesty, that's not a bad name to label it. Anyway, Troika Games faced a number of setbacks during development, including trouble with the source engine that also was used for the highly praised Half-Life 2, but also received pressure from publisher Activision to release the game already. In the end, Activision actually gave Troika Games an ultimatum to release the game, resulting in less than 1 month of playtesting and bug fixing. But in a small stroke of luck, the agreement with using the source engine meant that they could not release the game before Half-Life 2 was released, and thus, it earned another 3 weeks or so of bug fixing. And thus, when the deadline had finally lifted, Activision forced a release in the same week as Half-Life 2, which was a huge mistake, because no one paid attention to this game with such a juggernaut like Half-Life 2 in the same spotlight. In the end, Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines only sold 80,000 copies, which is absolutely horrible. Even for its time, titles like Halo 1 and 2 were doing 5 million. It also meant the end for Troika Games, only 3 months after the release of Bloodlines, and it was their least grossing game they had released. What's more is that the game was released in a state that was incredibly buggy and to some even unplayable. This was due to the short playtesting, and many agreed that the game was released in an unfinished state. Now, in all honesty, I don't remember it being that bad to where it was unplayable back then, but I do have to say that I stopped playing it at a certain point and never actually completely finished the game until many years later. So it could have well been that some game-breaking sections were in the parts that I never had experienced during the launch period. Now, that doesn't mean that my experience was perfect, as I too definitely had witnessed plenty of bugs and just unpolished scenes. Cutscenes often missed dialogue or animation, bodies would ragdoll into walls during combat, and there were also some glitches here and there. The game got a few official patches, but that only fixed but a fraction of all the problems. What was really special, however, was that after the initial flop of the game, it received a cult following that grew and grew and grew over time to the point where the game now is being recommended to lovers of RPGs. What's more is that a large group dedicated themselves to release unofficial patches to fix all the bugs and glitches, but also add in higher resolution options for more modern PCs, but even also adding new content and restoring content that was taken out before release. In fact, if you want to play it nowadays, you can't really do it without the unofficial patch if you want an optimal experience. The unofficial patch kept getting update after update, year in, year out, fixing ever more bugs and adding more things like cutscenes, models, dialogue, new magic powers, and even quests. The latest patch that I played with, which is I believe 10.7, was released only a few months ago, so it showed how much alive the community still is for this game and how beloved it is by its fans. It's an incredible amount of dedication and a true joy to behold. So let's talk about the story and setting of the game first. When you start a new game, you need to create a character and choose a clan that you are part of. There are 7 clans in total. Each clan has its own unique magic spells that you can utilize, as some let you transform into giant monstrous beasts for a couple of seconds to deal out devastating damage, while others have the ability to sap blood from their enemies from afar, or can use an ability that will make them super quick and in turn will make it look like time slows down, sort of like bullet time. Some of the spells overlap with a few clans, but some are also unique to a specific one, upping the replay value. But not only that, there are 2 particular clans that will offer you a vastly different experience from the other 5, and those are the Malkavians and the Nosferatu. The Malkavians are basically lunatic vampires. They hear voices and speak in weird tongues, often not making any sense. There are dialogue options that are only reserved for the Malkavians, like being able to talk to a traffic stop sign or convincing a random girl that you are her pet turtle? Yeah, it goes pretty nuts, and I know a lot of people really like this clan for all its giggles and weird humor that it can create. But I have to admit that I'm kinda turned off by the looks of the Malkavian, that I've never really played one for a very long time. You cannot customize your character's looks except for its clothing, and I just cannot roll with that weird hairdo and the look that this dude has going on. The Malkavian in the trailer for Bloodlines 2, on the other hand, looks a lot cooler, and I would love to finally delve deep into the crazy world of the Malkavians then. But where the Malkavian will give you a different experience in terms of dialogue option, the Nosferatu will be a different experience altogether. Since you look so hideous and monstrous, pedestrians will run away and alert the police if they see you. So instead of walking the streets like all the other characters, your best bet is to be moving through the stinky sewers to avoid anyone seeing you. All the quest givers will also insult you every second they get on how hideous you look, and some quests you cannot even do in certain ways just because you're a Nosferatu. I also don't really like playing as this since the sewers are so boring looking, but I love the fact that they went through the trouble to create a unique clan that, if you pick it, plays incredibly different than any other. It's also therefore noted that Nosferatu should definitely not be picked as a first-time playthrough, since you will get to see and experience only so much. I personally like the Tremere, which are basically your Matrix type of vampires with their long leather jackets, and they revolve around blood magic. Their society itself is very much obsessed with magic and magic creation, and its leader in the game looks straight up like a Morpheus homage from the Matrix. But my first playthrough, and the one I stick to the most, is unfortunately arguably the least interesting, and that is the Toreador. The Toreador are the artists clan, and seeing as I was always writing stories, creating videos, I kind of found myself attracted to this clan. They are all about artistic beauty and fashion, and that's nice and all, but it only gets you so much in terms of vampire lore. The Toreador are better seducers than the other clans, which will grant you a few opportunities here and there, but not to where it's all that noticeable. What's more is that their place in the vampire lore doesn't seem all that important, unlike the Bruja, with their rebellious mindset, the Tremere, with their obsession of magic, or the Ventru, which are the elite amongst the vampires and look down on others. The Toreador simply like fashion. Okay. So after you have chosen your clan, you then get to spend some points into your skills, and ooh boy, do you have a lot of skills to choose from. There are more than 20 skills to choose from, including your standards like strength, stamina, range, etc., but also security for lockpicking, computers for hacking, or charisma for persuasion. We have seen these types of upgradable skills in other games as well, including for example Star Wars KOTOR or indeed Fallout. But nowadays, it kind of feels like we have forgotten about those type of skills to level up, and it's such a shame since it fits so perfect in that role player's mindset. Nowadays, when you level up in an RPG, more often than not, you maybe can choose from a skill tree with 2 or 3 options. But with Bloodlines, every time you gain some experience and can level up some skills, you really have to think about what you level up, because a multitude of skills are very useful. What's cool too is that if you use the unofficial plus patch, you also get to choose your character's history, which will get you a buff and a debuff on some of your stats. For example, if you are an old-timer, you will level up your research skill faster than your computer skill, since you are a boomer, I guess. And as I said, a multitude of these skills are useful. If you did not level up your lockpicking all that much, and you are in front of a locked door which you cannot open, maybe there's a computer nearby that you can hack if you put some points into that and can open the door anyway. I honest to God miss this type of gameplay, and makes me want to revisit old classics like KOTOR, Fallout, and Deus Ex. There are definitely also less useful skills to level up, including intimidation and the earlier mentioned seduction. Basically, this gives you new dialogue options if their skill level is high enough to convince some people to do something for you, but they are both very underused. Persuasion, however, is definitely worth your time, since having this at a higher level can often result in getting additional rewards, receiving hints or secrets, or even having you to avoid entire tedious sections. But more about that later. Let's get back to the story. So after you have put some starter points in a few of the many skills, you finally get to experience the game. The opening cutscene shows you and someone of the opposite sex having a one-night stand. During the occasion, your partner wants to show you something and basically turns you into a vampire without your consent. Then when you wake up as your new self, you suddenly get stabbed in the heart and abducted by a group of vampires. In the Vampire Bloodlines lore, you cannot simply turn anyone into a vampire without the permission of your higher-ups, and thus, the vampire that was responsible for you turning is executed, while the heads of all the clans are watching. You then get to live and be spared to be set as an example to see what you can do and how useful you can be to the cause. At the head of this particular society in Los Angeles where the game is based is Prince Lacroix. Now everyone in the game calls him LaCroix, but since he actually himself tells you that he stems from the Napoleonic age, I personally prefer to call him Lacroix. Anyway, the prince is at the head of the Camarilla, which are an organized, wealthy group that adhere to the local vampire laws, which include not telling humans about vampires, etc. These laws are called the Masquerade, and is hence where the game gets its name from. Originally, it was a pen and paper RPG from the early 90s, so all the societal lore and history has been written down, making for an incredible, believable story, setting, and characters. For example, during the opening cutscene, a character by the name of Niles, who is the leader of the Anarchs group, protests against your initial execution as you had no choice in the matter of becoming a vampire. Later, you actually learn that he too was without a sire and left to his own. The Anarchs group that he is part of also try to adhere to the Masquerade laws, but don't like how the hierarchy is set up with the prince in his high tower. Also worth noting here is that the earlier mentioned unofficial plus patch already adds new content here in this opening cutscene for those who want to experience that. If you play with this plus patch, which I highly recommend you do to get the best experience, there will be bite marks on your character's neck in the cutscene. Also, Nines will have extra dialogue that is not in the original cutscene, and there will be actual animations of the head being cut off from the one who made you a vampire, and there are more models and characters throughout the scene. I will also link the unofficial patch down below in the description, and once you install it, just make sure to check the plus patch as well to enjoy all that new content in the game. So then the game finally begins. You spend about 20 minutes or so in a very well designed tutorial with likable character Jack, voiced by the same guy who also does Marcus Phoenix's voice from Gears of War. And then when that is over, you get to be sent out in the wide world and the first hub in LA, which is Santa Monica. You wake up in your crappy looking apartment and can immediately go exploring and discovering all sorts of nifty things at your own leisure. Your main quest at that point is to meet with a guy called Mercurio. But at that point, you're still in your apartment, and you can check out your email, can listen to the radio or news on the TV, you can loot some supplies from your apartment or the neighbors. It might sound weird, but the crappy and sleazy look of it all is actually one of the main attraction points that I'm so fond about this game. It feels both very noir, gothic, and punk. All the apartments are old and moldy, clubs are dirty and sleazy, hospitals have creaking lights and sounds of coughing patients in the backgrounds. Prostitutes work the streets during the night, bums walk on the pavements talking to themselves, and gang members can be seen checking each other out for a piece. It's a type of world that we don't see too often in video games, and that is what makes it so refreshing to explore. Instead of the game being open world, you get to visit 4 open hub areas that have various quests in them, much like Deus Ex. And in Vampire, they are absolutely beautifully designed. At least Santa Monica and downtown hubs are. From the moment you leave your apartment, you can go anywhere in the hub and start exploring, talking to strangers to see if they have quests, go to the shop and see if they have any special merchandise, or just head towards the main quest. Whenever you talk to someone, you have multiple responses to choose from, and I'm so happy that the type of responses you can give vary so greatly. I cannot tell you how sick I am of that BioWare mechanic, where they have the blue or red answer, clearly indicating which is the good and which is the bad answer. With Bloodlines, you actually need to read the responses in order to know which you want to choose, and it's not always the case that the number 1 answer is the nice answer, or the answer that will get you some extra XP or other reward. And the writing is absolutely superb, and of a level that we so rarely see nowadays. It's honestly also sometimes pretty dark, and some of the answers you can give probably would not fly in today's sensitive age. You can be an absolute douchebag in this game to people, and that is saying it mildly. There were 7 dialogue writers for the first Bloodlines, and one of them actually works on Bloodlines 2, so I hope that the dialogue in that game also will be nearly as good, despite it probably being toned down a bit to compensate with today's sensitive views. Also, quick note here, this review was written before the news got out that the guy I mentioned just now, who actually worked on part 1 and also worked on part 2, got fired. So, yeah, let's hope that goes well. Anyway, back to the review. But the voice acting is also very well done, and do a very convincing job of being sensual, crazy, angry, or plain outright hilarious. They really make each character come alive and be memorable, including the seductive Jeanette or Velvet Velour, the cool Bertram Tongue, Nines Rodriguez, or Maximilian Strauss, or the quick-tempered Damsel and Brother Canker. All incredibly different, distinct, memorable, and therefore immortal. No pun intended. So for the first main quest, and don't worry, I'm not going through each and every quest individually. You need to retrieve some explosives that were stolen from Mercurio by a bunch of thugs at a beach house. Sounds easy enough, and like your standard quest. If you talk a bit more to Mercurio, you will also get a quest to find him some morphine and to get his money back that was also stolen by the same thugs. So you make your way up to the beach and towards the house. And the reason why I talk about this mission is that it so beautifully demonstrates the openness and freedom that you have when it comes to handling the situation. You can, for example, just go over to the house and talk your way inside. If you have enough persuasion points, you can convince the thugs to give you the explosives back. Or, if you don't like that plan, you can just walk up with your weapon out and beat all of them to a pulp and take the explosives that way. But there is also a loose plank in the fence to the left, which allows you to sneak to the back and turn off the lights so that one thug comes out of the back, which you then can stealth kill. You can then sneak into the house unseen and retrieve the explosives without anyone knowing you were there. You can then leave and hand in the quest, but if you look further in another room behind a vent, you can find the stolen cash, a whopping $250. You can choose to give that back to Mercurio, or you can say that you didn't find it and keep it, making it possible to buy a good weapon or some skill books that will give you a free skill upgrade in computers or ranged fighting, unless you have already put some points into those skills, because with those books you can only level it up to level 2. All these choices and all these outcomes are for you to decide and play around with, and it's absolutely wonderful. Again, it's not that current BioWare vibe, where you can tackle a situation in 2 different ways, but here you often have more than 2 different ways to deal with things, and this comes forward in multiple quests, both side quests and also main quests. At a certain point you need to get onto a ship to locate a sarcophagus on board, but you cannot let the guards see you. You also cannot kill them, so you have to sneak around, which unfortunately works really wonky in the game. The stealth gameplay simply sucks. But if you have enough points into persuasion, you can convince one particular guard to hand you a report that has all the information on it that you need, meaning you don't have to deal with the sneaking around part at all. Or later in Hollywood, you head to a cemetery that has a zombie problem, and you are asked to deal with it by the gravekeeper. You have to hold out against infinite spawning zombies for 5 minutes unless you manage to get a date, aka a pro, for this man, or a third option would be that if you are playing as a female and your seduction points are high enough, you can show him a good time and can skip that zombie holdout mission altogether. And I say skip, but it doesn't feel like you are cheating or blocking out necessary content that you want to experience. It just feels like a choice you made on how to deal with a certain situation, and therefore it sticks and doesn't feel cheap. What also helps is that the combat and stealth in the game are just plain bad, but we will get to that later. In so many RPGs still to this day, a lot of the side quests are pure trash. Just simple fetch quests that are just so numbing to the mind. I still cannot believe that in something like Final Fantasy 15, we have missions like go and retrieve a dog tag, or go and collect certain frogs. In Bloodlines, so many of the side quests are worth doing since they bring you in such interesting and unique situations. Now many of them still do come down to go there and find or kill somebody, but it's all so varied in context. One particular side quest that comes to mind is you having to find a certain hitman that works for a bail bonds company. First of all, the guy that gives you the quest is the sleaziest Ron Jeremy looking guy, and he's pure gold with how much of a sleazeball and con artist this guy is. Throughout this quest, you visit the hitman's apartment, head towards a tattoo shop, and eventually end up at a limp prosthetics studio. The owner of that studio welcomes you in under great enthusiasm and wants to make some photos of you downstairs. The lobby is brightly lit with pretty classical music playing, but as you head down towards the basement, you start to notice that something is off. Freaky photos of limbs and bones are stuck to the wall, and these weird dolls are everywhere. Then you come across these weird rooms with chairs and straps on them, and eventually even an operating table with lots of blood underneath. Turns out, the owner is a maniac that kidnaps people and takes their limbs. He then even actually attacks you with a severed arm. I mean, you cannot make this stuff up. And it's all missable, but was one of the most memorable and atmospheric moments in the entire game. Another example is an abandoned hospital, where a TV camera crew gets eaten and slaughtered alive while you are exploring it, creating a creepy, almost horror-type mood. It turns out that these people were murdered and eaten by a so-called flesh eater, who's like a vampire but also needs to consume flesh. You can choose to kill her, but she has 3 quests for you to do, or you can even skip the entire hospital altogether and never even meet her. But once you do befriend her, you can send some obnoxious people her way to be taken care of. I would probably say that the game's flow and its quests are almost perfect for the first half of the game, and its first 2 hubs, Santa Monica and Downtown. Its main quests are mostly fun and can be done in different ways, and it has various great side quests on offer as well. For the first 2 hours, I don't think I had engaged in combat with any character at all, yet I wasn't bored once. Instead of fighting, I snuck around, bribed people, persuaded people, hacked into security systems, and investigated crime scenes. There's never a dull moment, you are always excited for what comes next. The music in both Santa Monica and the Downtown Hub are also super chill and so nice to just have on the background while you are strolling over the streets. It's just so nice and laid back, feeling like you can just do whatever and chill at your own pace. In Hollywood, the third hub, there are still some really big highlights that you get to experience, like the cemetery or some quests you have to do for the character Isaac or stripper Vivi. But things do start to go downhill a bit here with less interesting side quests as a whole, a really obnoxious and long-lasting combat section, and a hub that's much smaller and less interesting. But the fourth and final hub, Chinatown, is by far the worst. You can really see that the creators had to rush this area to finish the game, as the hub is super small, feels empty, and its side quests and also main quests feels rushed, simple, and sometimes outright sloppy and boring. One thing I still have to note before we head on over to the bad things is the Haunted Hotel quest, as this particular quest reached a legendary status amongst gamers, and many back in the day knew about this quest even for those who hadn't bought the game. In this particular quest, you are tasked with heading into a hotel and finding a pendant to release a curse created by a ghost. Where some areas are maybe a bit creepy or eerie, this particular area is downright straight horror. It's heavily inspired by The Shining, with a husband killing his wife with a fire axe, and you see reminiscing ghosts and hear whispers throughout the hotel. When you suddenly turn around, there's a ghost standing there for just a second, where a white womanly figure runs by screaming as you run down a hall. One has to realize that back then, a game like Fear had not come out yet, so this atmospheric level was so tense and creepy that it left an impression on anyone who played it. I have played the game now a dozen of times or so this game doesn't scare me anymore, but every time I replay it, those creepy whispers still make the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. They tried a couple of more times to replicate something similar with the earlier mentioned hospital in Downtown or a mansion in Hollywood, but none succeed so much in the creepy and scary atmosphere as this level does. Another note with the unofficial Plus patch is that it actually adds some new scares and sounds during this level as well, so it might be worth checking out for those who know this too well and see if they will be surprised. So I believe I have talked about most what I love about this game. Its vast array of interesting characters, its brilliantly written dialogue and answering options, its huge amount of skill points, its interesting side quests creating memorable experiences, the openness of the level design and quests to where you can do multiple quests in more than 2 ways, and the incredible world and lore that you take part in. It's all honest to God, so incredible and of a level that we seemingly have lost with games nowadays. So you have heard me praise the game for a long time, and I wish I could do nothing but praise the game, but that is unfortunately not the case because now we need to talk about the combat in the game and also the final hub area. So first the combat. Plain and simple, the combat in Vampire Bloodlines is absolutely crap. It sucks. I've heard some real hardcore enthusiasts defend this by swearing it's like the pen and paper RPG where you have a dice roll each time, but those people then don't have a good understanding of bad game design. So the combat is divided up in unarmed, melee, and ranged. The unarmed and melee combat revolve around third-person fighting, and you frantically hit the mouse button, putting as your character takes wide swings to hit the enemy. Now it's simple and feels clunky, but all in all the melee does an okay job and can even feel satisfying with bodies often flying through the air in hilarious fashion after succeeding a combo. It definitely would not turn any heads, and you often clip through objects and sometimes hits won't connect properly, which is just part of it being a buggy mess again. But the true horror with this game lies in its ranged combat. Ranged combat in this game is absolutely horrible for the most part. For the first 5 to 6, dare I even say 7 levels of ranged skill points, some of your guns are outright unusable in some combat situations. By leveling up your range skill, you will not only do more damage, but also have less sway, less recoil, and a smaller aiming reticle for better aiming. But for weapons like the Uzi, that have such an insane recoil, it's just not good to use on human enemies. The only time it had a function is when you fight against a target like a giant monster that is so big that you cannot miss wherever you spray. And it's also not like that is the exact purpose of those weapons, because you get these Uzis where you're mostly still fighting small targets like regular people. Many of the pistols are incredibly inaccurate and low on damage, making it to where everyone pretty much agrees that for the first 2 hubs or so, or the first half of the game, you mostly invest in melee skills and thereafter in range. And oh boy, will you need those ranged skill points eventually. So at the end of the first hub, you are asked with heading towards a warehouse to lay down a bomb. This is another pretty good mission, as you have the option to sneak past a lot of guards and climb up a roof and crawl through a pipe in order to skip all the guards and head straight towards the office in the center of the warehouse. If not, there's a lot of uninteresting sloppy combat waiting for you, so again, this section is saved by its great level design. But from the second hub onward, you have a few missions where sneaking is not an option and you have to do it via the combat way. In downtown, it's not that bad yet, with you fighting through a zombie-filled crack house that doesn't last too long and a parking lot that is already a bit worse. Multiple enemies will use long-distance weapons, meaning you will take a lot of damage quickly if you go with a melee approach. But then in the third hub, you get confronted with one of the worst sections in the entire game. And this is also the section where I originally stopped when I bought the game, and I even stopped once more when I replayed it again afterward before giving it a long break, just because it was so boring. The lead up to this quest is actually really cool, with you having to search for this snuff film, and you then head towards a mansion that is filled with small demons that are quick and agile and are fun to fight for maybe 2 minutes. But then you just about had it. And then the section continues in the sewers, and this section just goes on and on and on and on forever. There are no interesting RPG elements to be found here, no alternative ways or options, just you go in there and fight, fight, fight. The one thing that this game absolutely fails at. Besides that it is buggy and the final hub, I think almost everything about this game is perfect except for its combat. There's even a maze section in the sewers, and that area just looks boring, the enemies are annoying and plentiful, and the gameplay simply is not fun. When you finally are done with it, you get to the Nosferatu home and can get some side quests, of which some just start to become a bit boring and tedious, like setting up webcams in the house or setting up a network in several shops. Nothing interesting to be found here. But then you come to the fourth hub, and as I said, this is simply such a stark contrast in quality with the other areas, even in terms of writing. None of the characters I mentioned earlier were from this hub area, because they are simply not memorable at all. They don't have a lot of interesting things to say, to offer, or are just very shallow and serve not a lot of purpose. One guy owns a restaurant, you meet with him once, then need to free his daughter, and then he gives you the address of a new guy, and you never get to see this owner again. Or this self-made bad guy of a syndicate calling himself the Mandarin, a name that has some expectation behind it, but is just a mad scientist who wants to do some experiments on you, who's then killed after you escape the test chamber. The side quests this time are also just go here, grab this from the fridge and bring it back. Just all very lackluster and very clear that the creators had no time to flesh this area out. It honestly would have been better for the game's pacing to get rid of this area altogether, as it would have still left the game to be a good 14 to 15 hours, which is plenty enough. It's also here in the 4th hub where you get more missions where you're forced into combat, though I did discover that you can just run towards the exit door and skip all that fighting. I just turned on bullet time and ran straight for it, because I did not want to deal with all that crappy combat. But then the game makes it even worse by putting you in some of the most boring and tedious areas towards the end, where you need to go after vampire hunters, head into another crack house filled with vampires and addicts, and heading towards a temple filled with guards armed with katanas and crossbows. They all have long-range weapons, and often the areas are very open, meaning you will be dead in seconds if you go with a melee build. I'm not kidding in saying that if you haven't put enough points into ranged or combat in general, that you might actually get stuck here. In one section of the temple where you are facing all the katana guards, I kid you not when I say that I used over 400 bullets to kill all the enemies with a range skill of 8, and it still wasn't enough to kill every single enemy. It just isn't fun. It's also frustrating since you get killed or damaged so easily, and these levels follow each other up, creating a combat section that goes on for several hours, which just doesn't work. I'm not kidding in saying that if this game was combat only, I would have probably scored well below a 7. All these levels also just feel rushed and uninspired, with you fighting in caves, long corridors, and abandoned apartments. Once again, there's no other option for you to do things different. You are forced into this area that just doesn't work in the game. Now, some of the guns definitely can become very strong, with the sniper being able to take out targets with one hit every time you get a headshot. But often you are faced against 7, 8, or even more enemies, and they all just rush you, making the long distance headshots impossible, and you have to resort to other weapons. With a range skill of 8, the guns were doing enough damage to where the enemies would go down with 3, 4, or 5 shots, but there were just so many that it felt like it never stopped. And then at the end, you get one of 5 endings, which is ultimately determined by a choice you make during a cutscene right before. A very boring cutscene at that, and felt again just cheap and simple way to wrap things up. Lastly, I should also say that the game is indeed still very buggy and glitchy. Especially towards the end, your character will have some very poor and weird animations like walking or performing certain actions. Particular animations are simply incomplete, are still absent of sound, and I've seen plenty of characters glitch through the world or disappear into a wall when I stealth-killed them. Even with the unofficial patch, there are still plenty of bugs and glitches, but in all honesty, the good things that come with this game with its characters, dialogue, RPG elements, and freedom of choice in quests are so incredibly good that it overshadows all those bugs and makes it still worth playing and experiencing. It's just that the combat and the second half of the game dip in quality so much to where it will actually take off some points. Graphically, the game also is still a bit lackluster. Despite being on the Source engine, there's hardly anything you can interact with that is physics-based, and the pedestrians on the streets sometimes look like PlayStation 1 models with blocky hair to boot. But as I said, the world, lore, characters, RPG skills, and quests are for the most part so incredibly well done and from such a high level that I can still wholeheartedly recommend this game to anyone who's a fan of RPGs in the broadest sense. And yes, I too think this is one of the best RPGs that has ever been made. If you love RPGs, you owe it to yourself to experience this and see all the different options and possibilities it gives you. In the end, Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines gets an 8.7. Now, some might say that this is a low number for something that is labeled one of the greatest RPGs ever made, but nowadays people seem to think that games aren't worth your time if it doesn't have at least a 9, whereas an 8.7 is still an excellent number. I personally would have been ecstatic if I received an 8.7 on a test score. And then there's also the fact that the combat and dip in quality in the end are so bad that it's purely thanks to the brilliant quest design, first 2 to 3 hubs, characters, and world that it reaches such a high and good score. Nothing but well deserved for Bloodlines, a game that still gets so much love and support today, including by me. And we all hope, of course, that Bloodlines 2 will be a worthy successor to this gem of a game. The bar is set very high, but various people are working on it that also worked in the original, so let's pray that we will get something great.